A somewhat heavy past between France and Africa. How would you summarize it, especially for the young people who are watching us? Listen, for the young people who are watching us, I think we need to tell them, your future will not be built without Africa. It is impossible. It is impossible. It is impossible. It is impossible. It is impossible.
Why does the Western elite persist in viewing the black African as an inferior being? A body to be exploited, a life to be neglected, a voice to be silenced. When hundreds of young Africans drown in the Mediterranean, silence. When blood flows on the continent, indifference. When labs test vaccines on black humans like they would on cattle, no one shakes. When nuclear bombs explode on African lands, humanity looks the other way. Overly independent leader. They sign his death warrant. A country is too free. It will undergo diplomatic, monetary, and military stifling. Why this contempt? Why this cold, dehumanizing mechanism? To understand this relentless logic, we need to delve into the heart of the colonial unconscious, into the roots of imperial thought, where it all began, the Code Noir. This is an uncompromising, two-part documentary that goes back to the origins of the system, from legalized slavery to methodical colonization, from military domination to monetary submission, from the Black Code to today's French Africa. Educate, awaken, unmask. Welcome to the Black Code, the colony and the neocolony. Before we even go back to the origins, let's take a moment to look at the facts. Concrete, unquestionable.
August 15, 1944, 100,000 soldiers. The first waves land at 8 o'clock in the morning. During the night, commandos landed at Cap Nigre, at the tip of Espion, and on the Levant Islands. Very quickly, the French troops arrive, 2.5 times more numerous, mostly from the colonies in Africa. In just 2 weeks, Toulon, Marseille, and almost all of Provence are liberated. The operation is a resounding success. After liberating Normandy, the Allies land in Provence. The war is not over, yet colonial news will turn bloody. The final victory is approaching. The army must be whitewashed to assert to the world that the people of France are liberating themselves. The government then decides to demobilize several regiments of Senegalese riflemen. To speed up their return home, the authorities promise that they will receive their pay as soon as they arrive in Dakar. Confident, most of the riflemen set sail. My father's name was Antoine Jean Habibou, and he was enlisted in the Senegalese riflemen. They land in Dakar and are sent to a camp that has been prepared for them. There are more than 1,000 people in the clearing. They continue the process to get paid their dues, which were owed. And after insisting, one day, the commander of the Thiaroye camp arranges a meeting for them at the parade ground in Thiaroye. On December 1, 1944, they are awakened by the bugle. They are asked to gather on the esplanade, and they realize that the camp is completely surrounded by a series of various regiments. To subdue the riflemen, the officers order to fire. The machine guns crackle, and bodies collapse. And they shoot at people who were just asking for what was due to them. It wasn't even a demand for a salary increase or a specific benefit. We were owed the salary. What I know, or else I wouldn't be here, is that my father laid down immediately. And he is among those who survive and are labeled as leaders of this so-called armed rebellion. And 34 people are sentenced, from 10 years to 2 years in prison. My father was sentenced to 10 years in prison. They protested without being armed. They have no weapons, They are cowardly lured. And those who did it were not punished, that is the evil. The repression turned into a massacre. There are more than 50 dead and dozens injured. The authorities have committed the irreparable. They fired without warning on their brothers in arms.
Nuclear fallout from France's tests in Algeria continues to devastate the country 60 years later. Local researchers say thousands of Algerians have suffered the effects of nuclear radiation across the Algerian Sahara, and many of the toxic sites have not been decontaminated. On February 13, 1960, the French army detonated an atomic bomb as a test in the Algerian Sahara. The plutonium-filled bomb transformed the sand into black shards and was followed by 16 other nuclear explosions. The bomb was reportedly 3 times more powerful than the one dropped by the US on Nagasaki, Japan in 1945, which destroyed everything within 1.6 kilometers of its range. The French army claimed there were no signs of life in the vicinity of the blast, but Algerian sources say that is far from the truth.
In 1960, when the bomb detonated, there were more than 6,000 inhabitants. Regan was not in the middle of nowhere. Many of those who were contaminated have already passed away due to unknown medical causes. They were told they had rare illnesses, but they didn't really know the specific nature of their illness.
Protests soon erupted after the blast as fallout from the bomb was detected, as far as Senegal, the Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, and Sudan. But the ground tests were not enough for French authorities. They decided to conduct underground tests in the Hogar Mountains. Those tests also caused pollution. Radioactive matter was spewed into the atmosphere during a barrel bomb detonation as the blast site was not properly sealed. 9 soldiers and several officials were heavily contaminated by the experiment. After many tests there as well, France shifted its experiments to French Polynesia. In 2010, France passed a law to compensate the victims of nuclear radiation in Algeria, but it requires claimants to have been residents of the region as the tests were happening, and it only recognises some illnesses. The Algerian government is yet to receive complete maps of French experiments in the region.
There is nuclear waste underground and we do not even know where it is located. Patients simply want to live in their hometowns without nuclear waste.
We are in 1963. The attack on the Togolese president's residence in Lomé began in the evening, at 11 p.m. Sylvanus Olympio was assassinated the next morning at 7:15 a.m. in front of the gate of the United States Embassy, from which he had just been extracted. Sylvanus Olympio, born on September 6, 1902, and assassinated on January 13, 1963, in Lomé, was a Togolese politician. He was the first president of the Togolese Republic from April 1960 until January 13, 1963. On April 27, 1960, the independence of Togo was proclaimed, thanks in particular to the struggle of one man, Sylvanus Olympio. On April 9, 1961, Sylvanus Olympio was elected the first president of the Republic of Togo. In Paris, a Gaullist power feared that Olympio's political autonomy, which was not likely to be sympathetic to socialism but was attached to the interests of Togo itself, would lead him to jeopardize French economic interests. Sylvanus Olympio, with a societal vision that places the citizens of Togo at the center of all concerns and not Western interests. The break with the CFA franc, the currency of French colonies in Africa, and the autonomy to issue a currency. The construction of infrastructure to make the Togolese economy viable, particularly an autonomous port in Lomé. The revision of mining contracts, particularly the one on phosphate that France had been exploiting, for free for many years. The absence of military cooperation with France as Togo intended to dismantle an army made up solely of gendarmerie and police. The accelerated development of key sectors, namely, agriculture to feed the population, health, and education. France saw serious threats there. After his opposition to the construction of a seaport in Lomé on the pretext that neighboring Dahomey had one under construction, France saw an even greater danger that it would have to contain. Sylvanus Olympio wanted to break with the CFA franc and issue his own currency. To this end, he had prepared with the Bank of France a break agreement that was to be signed. On January 15, 1963,
The threat became more precise when, after the failure of all French attempts to dissuade him, ranging from the most extravagant proposals to death threats, Sylvanus Olympio launched a call for bids for issuing currency that was won by England, which would issue a new currency guaranteed by Germany. France, seeing that nothing could stop the Togolese independence movement, decided to end the life of the man who was driving the machine. Yadima Nassim publicly claimed responsibility for the assassination, but Yadima would later say that it was not him who shot the president, suggesting the work of a direct French hand.
On Tuesday, November 9, 2004, after 2 days of near war between France and Côte d'Ivoire, French soldiers and Ivorian protesters found themselves face to face in the heart of Abidjan, at the Ivoire Hotel. Around 4:15 p.m., the French army opened fire. These images were filmed by Ivorian television. The toll was 7 dead and dozens injured, according to Abidjan. In the days following the shooting, French authorities provided several versions of the events. Michel Alliot-Marie does not mention the French gunfire. There were exchanges of shots and fire between the crowd, the young patriots, and the soldiers, the military, and the Ivorian gendarmes who were positioned between the crowd and the French armored vehicles.
A secret agent emerges from the shadows, and not just any agent. Jean-François Louis, former #1 spy of the French services in Libya. He was stationed for the DGSE in Tripoli during the Arab Spring before the fall of Colonel Gaddafi. His ultra-secret mission is then very clear. It is a mission that the Élysée has given to the DGSE to get Libyan personalities who could be turned against Gaddafi to defect. France, which had previously welcomed the Libyan dictator with great pomp, now wants his downfall. In this context, our spy, the man from Tripoli, set himself a goal to weaken Gaddafi by obtaining, for example, the defection of his foreign minister. You push people to betray their country, after all. Not only their country, but also their convictions. Moussa Koussa will indeed defect and find asylum in England. In the meantime, the military intervention led by France and Britain dealt a fatal blow to Gaddafi's troops. The galvanized rebels are at the gates of power. Jean-François Louis also had the mission to approach them and especially to help them. They pointed us to such and such a place. There is such a unit of Gaddafi that is stationed, which regularly sends missiles to our villages. Do something for us. So I send that to Paris. Whether or not they send NATO planes after that, it escapes me, of course. I don't press a button and have the planes arrive. It's in the movies, unfortunately. What is not a movie either are these images of the last moments of Gaddafi. He attempted to flee in a convoy. He was lynched and assassinated. Jean-François Louis denies the rumor that he was killed by a French spy.
Wow. Huh. Unconfirmed. Yeah. Unconfirmed. No. Unconfirmed reports about Gaddafi being captured. Unconfirmed. Yeah, we've had too many. We've had a bunch of those before. We've had, have had him captured a couple of times.
So I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed.
We came, we saw, he died.
The solution is not to take Africans and move them to Europe. The solution is to free Africa from certain Europeans who exploit it and allow these people to live off what they have. This is called the CFA franc, a colonial currency that France prints for 14 African nations, and by virtue of which it exploits the resources of this nation. This is a child working in a gold mine in Burkina Faso Burkina Faso is one of the poorest nations in the world. For Burkina Faso, which has gold, France prints colonial currency. In return, it demands that 50% of everything Burkina Faso exports ends up in the coffers of the French treasury. The gold that this child crawls into a tunnel to extract mostly ends up in the coffers of the French state. So
it is a coup against a democratically elected president. So it was said that France was too committed in support of President Bazoum. I read the newspapers, I sometimes hear the comments from other capitals. But what would we do if a coup like that happened in Bulgaria or Romania? We will engage because the coup leaders have offered us a prime minister? So we will get involved, that's good politics. We shouldn't be extreme, we are not at home. Is that what the other capitals want to do? And we would like to say that democracy is an idea that is good for Africa. We are not applying double standards. It's unacceptable. And from Washington to other European capitals, I have heard voices, I have listened to newspapers, I have read columns that explain to us, don't overdo it, it becomes dangerous, it becomes dangerous. No, we must be clear, consistent, and so our policy is simple. We do not recognize the coup leaders. We support a president who has not resigned, alongside whom we remain committed, and we support the diplomatic action, and when it decides, military action, of ECOWAS, in a partnership approach, which is the one I presented last February.
The scenery changes, the tools modernize, the speeches are made up, but the view of the dominator does not change. Whether he wields the Bible, the gun, debt or human rights, the goal remains: to keep the black man on his knees. In 1685, King Louis XIV promulgated a law that would forever mark the history of the French colonies, the Code Noir. Presented as an act of order and justice in the colonies, it was in fact a cold, methodical and ruthless document aimed at a single objective: make slavery more profitable, more stable and more effective. But why such a code? Why in 1685? And most importantly, why at that particular time? At that time, France looked at its European neighbors with envy. The rival colonial powers, England, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, have long exploited the wealth of their colonies through a perfectly established system, slavery. Before discussing the different European models of transatlantic slave trade, here is a truth that will surprise many. Long before the first Portuguese ships anchored on the coasts of Africa, before the European powers shared the black continent like a cake, another, much older, human trafficking was already raging. It's called the Eastern slave trade, the Arab-Muslim slave trade, and it began as early as the 7th century, long before Christopher Columbus or the first Atlantic slave trading posts. For more than 13 centuries, millions of Africans have been raided, deported, castrated, enslaved and sold in markets in the Middle East, North Africa, Persia, India, and even as far as China. Their black skin was their condemnation. Their faith, their culture, their humanity, erased. The caliphates, sultanates, Muslim merchants of the Arab world had no qualms about considering the black man as an inferior being, good for forced labor, domesticity, or harem. An estimated 17 million Africans were captured and enslaved in this treaty, not to mention the deaths on trans-Saharan roads, massacres, and countless children born of forced unions, often sterilized to avoid perpetuating the black race. Unlike the Western slave trade, survivors of the Arab-Muslim slave trade have rarely left offspring. Black slaves were assimilated, erased, or eliminated. Hence this chilling silence, this historical vacuum that few want to question. And yet, from Sudan to Zanzibar, from Mali to Arabia, this memory still haunts the people. The words abdi, which means slave, or zanji, which means black, long synonymous, have left deep scars. This part of history is not there to divide, but to enlighten, because slavery, whatever its origin, whether Christian, Muslim or animist, is a crime against humanity. And as long as some memories are honored and others denied, justice remains incomplete. Now let's go back to the different European models of colonial rule over Black Africa. Portugal is the first to introduce the transatlantic slave trade. As early as the 15th century, the Portuguese set up their trading posts on the West African coast, in Elmina, Luanda, and Bissau. Their empire extended to Brazil, which became the largest slave colony in history, where more than 5 million Africans were deported. The Portuguese created commercial and religious networks that would inspire all other empires, including France. They were the first to establish an industrial logic of slavery: extraction, deportation, exploitation. The Portuguese model did not just precede the Code Noir, it inspired it. Spain followed by establishing a ruthless colonial domination system in America. As early as 1503, the Spaniards used the first African slaves in the Caribbean. The Catholic Church blessed the conquest. The Indian settlements are subdued, and black slaves become the solution to the disappearance of Native American populations exterminated by forced labor and European diseases. The Spanish model is based on a symbiosis between the crown, the church, and merchants, a triangle that France will imitate with the Black Code: the king, the cross, and money, 3 pillars. Indeed, to justify the unspeakable, slaveholders have not only brandished chains or whips, they held up a Bible, deflected, instrumentalized, distorted, so that the black man accepts his slave status as a divine order. They began with Genesis 9:25-27, what they called the curse of Ham. Genesis 9:25-27. Cursed be Canaan, let him be the slave of his brother's slaves. Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and let Canaan be their slave. Shem, father of blacks, according to their falsified interpretation. Canaan, his son, cursed forever, to justify the enslavement of African peoples. Then they read Exodus 21:20-21, word for word, to teach that beating a slave to death was not a crime, as long as he survived a few days. Exodus 21:20-21. And if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod, so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. 21. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. They invoked Leviticus 25:44-46 to justify the hereditary slavery of foreigners, in other words, black Africans. Leviticus 25:44-46. You shall buy slaves and servants from the nations around you. You may leave them as an inheritance to your children after you, as property. You may keep them as slaves forever. Even in the New Testament, Paul and Peter's letters were deflected to entrench the obedience and submission of slaves. Ephesians 6:5. Slaves, obey your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the simplicity of your heart, as to Christ. Colossians 3:22. Slaves, obey your masters according to the flesh in all things, not only when they look upon you as if to please men, but with simplicity of heart in the fear of the Lord. 1 Peter 2:18. Servants, be subject in all fear to your masters, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are of a difficult character. These verses read on the plantations, engraved in the colonial catechisms, have served to break generations, not just bodies, but minds. The black man was no longer a human being, he was a possession, and God, they said, had wanted it that way. But the truth is that this Bible, used to chain, was also about justice, liberation, equality. These verses, they killed them deliberately. It was not God who wanted slavery, it's them, slave traders, and even today, the struggle continues to erase the effects of this perverse reading of the faith. The English set up the Barbados Slave Code from 1661, a code that legitimizes slavery, organizes punishment, prohibits mixed marriages, and turns the black man into a mere commodity. Barbados becomes the laboratory of the plantation economy, and sugar, the white gold of empires. The English model is brutal, but it is lucrative, very lucrative. Meanwhile, the Dutch are developing another slave empire. From Curaçao to Suriname, the Dutch West India Company organized the transatlantic trade with tremendous efficiency. Every slave, every crossing, every ton of sugar is calculated, rationalized, amortized. France is still behind, less organized, less structured, less profitable. So Louis XIV decided to change the rules. We need a framework, a doctrine, a single law for all French colonies. The Code Noir is therefore inspired by foreign models, but with a French touch, an alliance between commerce, royal power, and the Catholic Church. Behind the words compulsory religion, no escape, codified punishments, child slaves, a whole architecture of servitude is taking place. France is finally entering colonial modernity. Slavery becomes a competition. Who will exploit the most? Who will impose their dominance the longest? The Code Noir is not an anomaly. That's an answer, a catch-up, an adaptation of the French Empire to a violent, ruthless, and deeply inhumane international reality. As a result, settlements are no more than human factories, and slaves, numbers, tools, losses and profits. Thus in 1685, under the order of the throne of France, Louis XIV issued a decree that would forever change the fate of millions of Africans, the Code Noir. This black code served to standardize colonial exploitation, to make the French system more efficient and profitable, aligning with foreign models. Written by Colbert and signed by Louis XIV, the Code Noir is a legal code designed to organize the lives of black slaves in French colonies. In fact, it's a manual of dehumanization. It turns man into a commodity, the African into a property. Article 44 declares slaves to be personal property. The Code Noir is not a relic. It is a base. It establishes the legal, economic and racial foundations of colonial expansion. The colonization of the 19th century under the Third Republic took up the logic of the Black Code, civilizing, exploiting, controlling. Jules Ferry said in 1885, "The superior races have a right over the inferior races." This brutal paternalism becomes the official doctrine of the Republic. Africa is cut, oppressed, administered like a business. Slavery is later abolished, but forced labor replaces it. The Code of Indigenat, introduced in 1881, extends the spirit of the Code Noir: deprivation of rights, arbitrary violence, collective repression. In 1960, French-speaking Africa celebrates its independence. But the chains don't fall, they change shape. Behind the new flags, hymns and constitutions, France maintains its hold on their currency, its military bases, strategic enterprises, diplomacy. This is the era of France-Africa. Jacques Foccart, a man from the shadow of the Élysée Palace, organizes the networks. ELF takes control of Gabon's oil, mercenaries intervenes in Congo and Biafra. The CFA franc keeps the former colonies under monetary supervision. Colonialism is changing its face, more polished, more discreet, but equally well structured. In Paris, some still speak of Africa as a garden to be maintained. This paternalism is inherited from the Code Noir. It continues to shape the French view of Africa. Africa would be lagging behind, disorderly, incapable, without guardianship. The French political, economic and intellectual elites allow themselves to decide for Africa, to speak for it. However, it is in Western metropolises that interest rates, mining agreements and military operations are decided. If you pay attention, a disturbing constant appears. In several French-speaking African countries, some heads of state do not hesitate to crush their own people in order to remain in power. It's not just a matter of ambition, it's a symptom of a deeply rooted system. They do not derive their legitimacy from the ballot boxes, but from Western chancelleries, and especially from Paris. These leaders are trained, selected, placed by France, not to serve their nation, but to protect its strategic and economic interests. The rule of the game is simple. Obey France, and you will reign. Disobey, and you will be overthrown or eliminated. What if the people dare to stand up? You have the green light. Repress, torture, kill. The so-called international community will look the other way. This blood pact, this mechanism of control through terror is not new. It's the shadow of the Code Noir. A colonial legacy that some continue to execute in silence with zeal and fidelity. Because in this vision inherited from slavery, the free black is a threat, and the black standing is a mistake to correct. A crucial question arises: does the Code Noir still exist in French law? The answer is disturbing. Yes. Never abrogated, never officially buried, this text continues to haunt the legal and political imagination of a French elite that, consciously or not, still regards French-speaking Africa as a reserved domain, a colonial précaré. While other colonial powers such as Spain or Portugal have formally abolished their slave codes, France has allowed its own to float in the shadow of its institutions, like a relic whose spirit never really left.
In this month of commemoration for the victims of slavery, I solemnly speak on behalf of my colleagues Max Mathiasen and Olivier Servat, the deputy from Guadeloupe, and all my colleagues from the LIA group, to alert you to a troubling element of our legal arsenal: the formal non-repeal of the Black Code. The Black Code is the collection of royal decrees published in 1685 that governs the enslavement of human beings and reduces them to the legal status of movable property. These are abject punishments such as whipping, iron marking, cutting off hamstrings, ears, and the death penalty. While one might believe that the decree abolishing slavery in 1848 repealed the Black Code, this is not the case. No text has formally abolished it. So yes, France has declared the slave trade and slavery to be crimes against humanity. Yes, we have a national day of remembrance for the slave trade, slavery, and their abolition on May 10th. Yes, we have a national day in tribute to the victims of colonial slavery on May 23rd. But no, France has never repealed the Black Code. We are talking here about human dignity, about symbols owed to those women and men who were enslaved, to their descendants, in the name of restorative justice. The time has come for the Republic to cleanse itself of this ignominy that is the Black Code. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen deputies, Mr. President Panafis, thanks to your question, I discover this legal reality that I was absolutely unaware of. And I imagine all those around us, that the Black Code was not abolished in 1848, as we believe, after having been abolished during the French Revolution, then reinstated by Napoleon. We all believe it had been abolished, and I thank you for enlightening the national representation and the government on this issue. If the Black Code was not abolished in 1848, it must be. I commit on behalf of the government that a text enacting the abolition of the Black Code will be presented to Parliament, and I hope it will be voted unanimously. In any case, this is the government's intention.
Admittedly, this text is no longer applied in his letter, but in its spirit, in its logic, in its function of hierarchicalizing lives and racial domination, the Black Code survives. It survives in asymmetric defense agreements. It survives in the monetary control of the CFA franc. It survives in networks of influence, sustained coups, sanctions against rebellious leaders. It survives on the tenacious idea that French-speaking Africa is still a strategic property. Here's the truth: the Black Code has not been erased, it has been transformed. The history of the Black Code, colonization and neocolonization, is not a bygone past. It's an unresolved present. The legacies of the Black Code are in mentalities, institutions, economic treaties. We cannot break with slavery without breaking with the logic of exploitation. To decolonize is to dismantle inherited mechanisms, educational, monetary, military, ideological. The fight is one of memory, but also of sovereignty. The misfortune of Africa is to have met Europe on its way. Aimé Césaire. Decolonizing is not an act of love, it is an act of justice. Frantz Fanon. Imperialism is a system of exploitation which, in order to maintain itself, resorts to lies, contempt and force. Thomas Sankara. The Code Noir is not just a text, it is a symbol, a warning, a promise of rupture. History does not fade away, it transforms. Now let's move on to the second part of our documentary, Colonial Debt, the Hidden Empire of France in Africa. The people's awakening is underway.